Some monsters don't hide in shadows. They wear name tags, file taxes, wave to neighbors, until one night they don't. And by the time you notice they're gone, someone else already is. In 1997, the Sheriff's Department in Santa Clarita, California, responded to what they believed was a welfare check. A neighbor had reported a putrid smell and flickering porch light coming from a modest one-story home tucked behind a line of sycamores. The address was registered to a man named Grant Toller, age 46, a machinist for a small aerospace contractor, known in the area as quiet, polite, obsessively punctual. Officers entered through an unlocked door and were met with two things: silence and heat. The HVAC had been turned to maximum, and as they stepped into the kitchen, they found the oven door open, its interior coated in blood that had darkened into black glue. Inside was a torso, charred beyond recognition, resting on a metal baking tray. Nearby, neatly stacked beside it on folded kitchen towels, were the missing limbs, drained and cleaned like store-bought meat. It was the beginning of the discovery that would stain Santa Clarita's name in national memory for the next 4 years. Toller, who had been missing from work for 5 days, was not the victim. He was the architect. What investigators eventually uncovered was a string of disappearances dating back to 1992. Victims whose names had never crossed paths, whose lives had no obvious overlap, and who, according to the coroner's findings, had all been killed, butchered, and vacuum-sealed inside industrial packaging materials that Toller stored in the soundproof basement beneath his garage. Grant Toller was a man with no prior arrests. He'd been a high school valedictorian, took care of his disabled mother until her death, and paid every bill on time. He volunteered at a veterans support line. He owned a golden retriever. But what no one saw, not his co-workers, not his mailman, not even his parole officer from a 1983 DUI, was the growing system he built under his home. It wasn't a lair, it was a facility. A sequence of stainless steel tables, surgical clamps, drainage bins, cooling units. One detective said it looked less like a basement and more like a prototype for a USDA meat processing test site. What chilled investigators most wasn't the gore, it was the order. Each victim had been cataloged, not just by date, but by texture, marbling, fat content, age range, even notes on diet, habits, emotional temperament. Victim 4, lean, slight iron tang, good preservation window, frequent jogger, possible anemia. That was the kind of entry scrawled into Toller's private logbook, a black leather journal discovered beneath a floorboard, filled with 173 pages of calm, almost academic analysis of what he called terrestrial protein. It became clear, quickly, that the killings were not about rage, sadism, or even dominance. They were about experimentation. Toller had spent years, perhaps decades, attempting to refine what he called the post-moral kitchen, a belief that food ethics had no origin in law or religion, but only in structure and clarity. He didn't believe what he was doing was evil. In his final notebook entry, he wrote, "There are no commandments in the soil, only variables. I'm not hunting, I'm observing, curation, not cruelty." His process was brutal in method but robotic in logic. Victims were chosen not by beauty or vulnerability, but by a cold index: posture, stride rhythm, muscle density, and lifestyle. His house had no trophies, no keepsakes, no blood-stained clothes hidden in walls. What it had was packaging equipment, recipes typed in spreadsheet format, and a custom-built spreadsheet with portions broken down by weekday. Sundays, for instance, were reserved for high-fat organ meat. Wednesdays, lean muscle. Friday was soup. He planned meals like a mechanical chef with no regard for soul or suffering. What stunned law enforcement most was the absence of traditional pathology. Toller wasn't abused as a child. He had no traumatic war history, no voices, no religious delusions. He didn't hear God or Satan. What he had was curiosity, the purest, most unblinking kind. As a child, He'd been fascinated with how things were made, took apart clocks, radios, small appliances. His middle school science teacher once described him as methodical, eerily polite. That teacher later testified that in 8th grade, Grant had dissected a rabbit in class, not with glee, but with such calculated efficiency that it unnerved even the instructor. When they found Grant Toller, he wasn't hiding. He was in his backyard, shirtless, watering his vegetables. He didn't run, didn't resist. He simply said, "It's not finished," and asked if they'd be kind enough to let the dog stay with a neighbor. That level of calm never broke, not during interrogation, not during trial, not even during sentencing. He admitted to 14 murders. DNA confirmed 9. The other 5, he said, were archived in compost. The trial was swift, the public reaction unrelenting. Protesters demanded the death penalty. Animal rights activists strangely flooded the courthouse, torn between horror and warped admiration of his culinary control. But what lingered most wasn't his method, it was how long he'd gotten away with it. Almost a decade of precision killing in a mid-range suburban house, surrounded by people who thought they knew him. He shopped at the local farmer's market, donated blood twice a year, wrote polite letters to the HOA about sidewalk maintenance. No one noticed the heat patterns beneath the garage. No one asked why his trash always smelled like bleach. No one thought to ask why he was always seen alone, yet always well-fed. In the years since his conviction, criminologists have struggled to categorize him. He didn't match any known typology. He didn't kill for sexual release, didn't stalk, didn't pose. He consumed, he organized. And when asked once why he never ate store-bought meat, he replied, "Because that's violence without responsibility. At least mine has context." In solitary confinement, he reads culinary textbooks and writes letters to industry chefs. None reply. But somewhere, in some deeper part of America's psyche, his case remains, not just as a horror story, but as a mirror. A quiet reminder that evil doesn't always come with screams or shadows. Sometimes it comes with recipes. And the terrifying thought that maybe, at some dinner table, some part of his work was served and swallowed without anyone ever knowing. The courtroom held its breath the day Grant Toller took the stand. It wasn't a requirement. His lawyers had advised against it. But he insisted, and when he spoke, the room fell into an unnatural stillness. Not because he was angry or defiant or broken, but because he was calm. So calm it unsettled even the seasoned journalists and detectives who had been there since day one. Dressed in a neatly pressed tan jumpsuit, his hair combed, glasses perched with quiet precision, he sat with his hands folded and explained, not apologized, not confessed, but explained his process. The crowd expected tears, rage, defensiveness, but what they got was closer to a university lecture. He discussed muscle breakdown rates, the effect of hormones on tissue preservation, how cooking temperatures altered the ethical dimension of consumption. "I've done more to understand the human body than most surgeons," he said once, in the same tone you might use to describe a chest opening. "And unlike surgeons, I used every part." That phrase became the headline. It ricocheted through news cycles. It haunted every juror who tried to sleep that night. And while the prosecution relied heavily on DNA evidence, the defense attempted a last-minute strategy of diminished capacity. They brought in psychiatrists, brain scans, childhood photos. But it was all flattened by Toller's own unwavering clarity. He didn't claim voices. He didn't deny intent. He simply denied that intent was criminal in the framework he had designed. "I obeyed a different geometry," he said. "Yours has corners, mine curves." The jury took less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, no chance of parole. Sentenced to 370 years in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay. But even behind concrete, the reach of what he'd done, or rather, how he'd framed it, began to spread. First came the letters. From fringe philosophers. amateur chefs, prison inmates, people who wrote to Toller not with disgust, but curiosity. Some saw him as a monster, others saw him as a prophet of bodily autonomy taken to its darkest edge. One letter, intercepted by prison officials, read, "You gave us the final recipe. Now we just have to decide what hunger means." What made Toller so dangerous wasn't just that he killed. It was that he offered people a rational reason to reclassify murder. He made consumption feel clinical. And in a world where people were already numb to slaughterhouses and disconnected from the ethics of food, his ideology slithered into the cracks. Even his prison behavior became part of the study. He refused all meat, became vegetarian. Not out of guilt, he told prison psychologists, but because the meat they served had no emotional context. He claimed that eating it was closer to eating cardboard. "I knew their stories," he said once about his victims. "You eat strangers." His guards reported that he was polite, almost pleasant. Read 5 books a week. Made no trouble. He arranged his cell like a prep station. Toothbrush aligned to the soap aligned to the sink edge, towel folded in 3s. He kept a daily journal, wrote letters to himself in mirror script. And once every 2 weeks, he requested a single page torn from a culinary textbook, which he would study obsessively. The only time he ever raised his voice in prison was when a replacement guard rearranged the condiments on his meal tray. "You've reversed intention," he barked. "That's theological vandalism." It became a running joke among staff, until 2 guards who laughed about him loudly outside his cell were later hospitalized with what appeared to be food poisoning. No proof it was him, no motive. But the kitchen staff now refuses to prep trays for his block. It's hand-assembled by the warden's assistant under surveillance. That fear, irrational or not, has turned him into a myth inside Pelican Bay. Inmates refer to him only by initials. Some call him the cook. Some just call him Recipe. He's never harmed anyone behind bars, but his silence carries weight. When another inmate was caught hoarding sharpened metal and claimed Toller told him to prepare the table, the prison launched a full internal investigation. Nothing came of it, but the paranoia stuck. Beyond prison walls, the ripples widened. A small but fervent online community began referencing his writings in dark corners of the web. Some reposted excerpts from his journal, others attempted to recreate his recipes using synthetic meat. The FBI flagged several of these forums, especially when a missing persons case in Portland involved a suspect who had written, "We deserve to taste what we ignore." The suspect was later found dead in a cabin, having consumed what authorities believed was part of his own thigh. On the wall above the stove was, scrawled, "Portion control is a sacred act." Again, no direct link to Toller, but the echo was there. Clinical, detached, terrifying. The academic world didn't ignore him either. At least 4 psychology theses were written on Toller in the decade following his arrest. One paper, published in a fringe ethics journal, argued that Toller represented a new species of killer, not driven by trauma or pleasure, but by philosophical experimentation. A dangerous evolution of the sociopath, one who seeks understanding, not thrills. Another paper called him the anti-hedonist cannibal, because his crimes were not rooted in indulgence but abstinence from traditional moral appetites. It was a gruesome idea that abstaining from feeling could be a greater threat than indulging in violence, a silence more potent than scream. Toller refused all interviews after 2011, but one final letter surfaced in 2014, leaked anonymously to a journalist in San Francisco. It was a single page, handwritten, no greeting, no signature, just one chilling paragraph. "I never wanted followers. I only wanted a kitchen where nothing lied to me. Blood tells the truth. Muscles don't hide. Fat doesn't pretend. The rest of you, the polite ones, you're the real devourers. You chew lives and call it Monday. I just took the mask off. Now it's your turn." After that, silence. No more letters. No more public contact. It's believed he remains in his cell, alive, still arranging condiments and reading about sauce reduction. But his presence lingers in the cracks of culture, not as an icon, not as a name people wear, but as a possibility. A door left ajar, a reminder that the line between chef and killer is not drawn with a blade, it's drawn with intent. And intent, as Toller always knew, is the hardest thing to convict. Long after the cell door closed on Grant Toller, the world didn't know what to do with him. Not really. There were no books written from his point of view, no prison art exhibitions, no final confessions to unlock the motives behind the method. He wasn't interested in forgiveness or infamy. He simply existed, preserved, like the specimens he once cataloged. Professors studied him, yes. Documentaries tried to map the blueprint of his madness. But what stayed with people wasn't a theory. It was the silence. That cold, clinical vacuum he moved inside. There were no screams in his story, no crying neighbors, no dramatic police chases. Just the quiet hum of a man doing something unthinkable behind a garage door for years while the world looked away. If Toller's horror was structure, a methodical desecration of flesh in the name of curiosity, the man who came next was the exact opposite. His world was chaos, noise, blood in motion, a brute storm disguised as a person. While Toller made sure his victims disappeared completely, Rudy Denton wanted the world to see his, and hear them, especially hear them. The first time his name appeared in local California news, it was a footnote. Transient causes disturbance on Greyhound bus, taken into custody. No photo, no mugshot, just a name and a location. But by the time the country knew his face, by the time the screaming videos hit social media and footage leaked from gas stations and alleyways, Rudy Denton had turned Los Angeles into a stage. And what he performed there, in the span of 3 blood-soaked months in 2011, would cement him as one of the most unpredictable, uncontrollable, and animalistic spree killers in American memory. His story didn't start in one place. It was scattered, fragmented, just like his psychiatric records. Born in San Bernardino, raised mostly by state care, Denton had no consistent home, no formal education past the 6th grade, and no medical record that could fully explain the missing years between age 15 and 28. What is known, what detectives pieced together from arrest reports, old medical notes, and the testimony of terrified shelter workers, is that he didn't just snap. He unraveled, slowly, loudly, publicly. In 2009, he showed up at a downtown shelter with deep scratches across his arms and a notebook full of what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of sewer systems and storage lots. He claimed he was following the red wires and refused to sleep indoors. Staff noted his violent outbursts and obsession with wires, lights, and sound. But without a formal diagnosis or criminal offense, he was released. 18 months later, the first body appeared, a rideshare driver found on the edge of Echo Park, eyes gouged, mouth stuffed with electrical wire. 3 days later, a dog walker found beaten to death under a freeway overpass, earbuds jammed into his throat, wires still connected to a phone playing static. Detectives didn't connect them at first, no clear link. But the third victim, a teenage girl waiting outside a nightclub, her vocal cords cut and stuffed into a phone charger case, made the pattern undeniable. This was about sound, noise, communication, or maybe the destruction of it. And right in the middle of that theory stood Rudy Denton, who was finally caught on a gas station camera screaming into a payphone, hands dripping with what police later confirmed was blood. His arrest was a blur. He fought 6 officers, bit through one man's ear, and howled for 6 straight hours in a holding cell before collapsing from exhaustion. Once in custody, the real horror began. He talked, constantly, not about guilt, not about remorse, but about the cables, the invisible wires running through the city. He claimed he could hear people's lies through their devices, that every word spoken into a phone twisted the soul, that his job, His mission was to free people from their voices, to silence the cables. His confession wasn't a confession. It was a manifesto delivered in fragments, like static. He described his killings as unplugging, described his victims not by name or age, but by the volume of their voices. She was too loud, he said of one woman. He buzzed like a broken radio, he said of another. When forensic psychologists interviewed him, they found no coherent delusion, no diagnosis they could pin down. Paranoid schizophrenia was suggested, but didn't quite fit. He wasn't always disorganized. He knew where he was, knew dates, details, locations. His memory was precise, almost savant level, especially when describing wiring diagrams, phone booths, and city power lines. He'd once worked as a cable technician, briefly, before being fired for erratic behavior. That detail became central to the trial. Prosecutors painted him as a failed man lashing out at a world that silenced him. The defense argued for mental illness. The jury couldn't decide. He was found guilty of 12 murders, not guilty by reason of insanity for 3 others, and committed indefinitely to a Atascadero State Hospital. But what makes Rudy Denton's case so haunting isn't the brutality, it's the contagion. In the months after his arrest, 3 copycat attacks were reported, all involving cords, headphones, or phone booths. One suspect claimed Denton woke him up. Another wrote a letter to a local station. "The wires hum when I sleep." He showed us how to cut the current. None of those suspects had met Denton, but somehow his noise spread. During his initial evaluations at Atascadero, staff noted that when placed in soundproof rooms, Denton became eerily calm, almost gentle. He would sit for hours, tapping out sequences on the wall. Morse code, they assumed, but no translation ever made sense. When asked why the quiet soothed him, he simply said, "Because it's clean, no lies in the hush." His story isn't one of planning or method. It's not a puzzle like Toller. It's a rupture, a system failure in human form, a scream that kept echoing after the source went silent. And maybe that's why he haunts people still, because in a world that's always talking, always buzzing, the idea of a man who kills just to make it stop feels possible. Too possible. Some killers vanish in silence. Others leave behind noise that never stops echoing. But the ones we fear the most are the ones who make us question whether they were ever strangers to begin with. Grant Toller dissected human morality as if it were meat. Rudy Denton shattered the boundaries between madness and message. But the next man on this descent wasn't like either of them. He didn't crave silence or chaos. He wanted justice, but not the kind that lives in courthouses or law books. His name was Ellis Wade, and for nearly 4 years, he delivered his own verdicts across 3 states, leaving behind no blood at the scene, no broken doors, no alarms triggered. Just a folded piece of paper, handwritten in pen, tucked into the pockets of the dead. And always the same message. You owed someone. Now it's paid. His first confirmed victim was a county judge named Raymond Klein in Arizona, found slumped at his kitchen table in 2013, a single puncture wound to the neck, no sign of struggle. His security cameras showed nothing unusual, no forced entry, no fleeing suspect, just static. The paper note was in his suit jacket, folded precisely into eighths. At first, authorities treated it like a professional hit, but no motive emerged. No cartel connection, no disgruntled former client. Just a dead judge and a note. 6 months later, a retired police officer was found in Nevada, same method. Quiet house, no struggle. Note in the jacket, you owed someone. Now it's paid. It wasn't until victim 4 that they realized these were not random deaths. These were executions, surgical, symbolic, and always delivered to someone with a past. Some secret, something unresolved. FBI profilers were called in after victim 6. What they found wasn't just methodical, it was ceremonial. Ellis Wade had studied his targets. Each was a man in a position of power who had once dismissed or derailed a major criminal case. A corrupt parole officer, a detective who buried evidence, a prosecutor who dropped charges for a friend. These were men who had looked the other way. And Ellis Wade became the hand that looked back. He tracked their movements, their routines, their patterns of guilt. He didn't torture, didn't gloat. He just waited for the moment they were most alone and then ended them quietly, always with the same precise needle to the neck. Authorities later discovered it was a rare type of lab animal tranquilizer, lethal in the dose used and untraceable without specialized equipment. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the poison. It was the writing. Each note was inked with perfect uniformity. No hesitation, no emotion, just the message. You owed someone, now it's paid. No demands, no initials, no monologue, just debt, cleared. The press dubbed him the Ledger, and as the body count climbed, a strange split formed in public opinion. Some feared him, others rooted for him. Online forums dissected each victim's past, and in nearly every case, sleuths found whispers of buried corruption. A mistreated prisoner, a rape kit left untested, a case closed too quickly, and in each, a man who had escaped the system until Wade reopened the file in his own way. Vigilantism wasn't new in America, but Ellis Wade made it terrifyingly efficient and disturbingly elegant. There was no trail, no manifesto, just death, delivered with the precision of an invoice. The break in the case came by accident. A local librarian in Utah recognized the handwriting in a newspaper photo of the note left on victim 10. It matched the style of a man who frequently used the public computers to order obscure legal texts and spent hours cross-referencing old court documents. She provided surveillance footage and log-in timestamps. The FBI traced the IP addresses to multiple public libraries across 3 states, and every time they found the same signature in security logs. E.W. Wade had used his real name, but by the time they raided his apartment, he was gone. All that remained were legal pads filled with case numbers, court transcripts, and a single sheet of paper on the floor. The same sentence. You owed someone, now it's paid. Except this time, it was underlined, twice. Weeks turned to months, then a year. No more deaths, no more notes. Some believe he ended it there, that the list had been completed. Others believe he is still watching, still judging. Authorities keep a quiet eye on retired lawmen, judges, and lawyers who live alone. No one says it, but many suspect he's still out there, choosing his moments, not by opportunity, but by guilt. The kind of guilt you can't bury under titles or uniforms. The kind that festers in silence until it feels like a debt waiting to be collected. Ellis Wade never screamed, never left blood. He didn't demand attention, he demanded balance. And in doing so, he became something worse than a killer. He became a possibility. That justice, if ignored too long, might return wearing unfamiliar hands, and it won't knock next time. It'll just fold a note into your jacket and let the silence say the rest. Ellis Wade vanished like a ghost in the system he once hunted, but even as his story faded from the headlines, it left something behind, a deeper discomfort. Not fear of violence, but fear of exposure. The idea that even the most respectable faces might someday have their sins counted by someone outside the law. It rattled courtrooms and precincts in 3 states. Security was tightened. Background checks were reopened. But the silence that followed only made the dread worse. Because if Ellis Wade could infiltrate the cracks of power without noise or notice, who else could be walking among them? That's why no one paid much attention at first when the deaths began again. Different cities, different victims, no poison, no notes, just panic. Because killer number 4 didn't kill for justice, he killed for violation. And where Wade had precision, this man had passion. The kind of passion that didn't stop at death, the kind that kept going. His name or at least the one investigators came to use, was Micah Breyer, and everything about his profile contradicted itself. He lived alone in a trailer in Oregon, but moved constantly. He had no digital footprint, but was fluent in surveillance tech. He had a GED, yet handwritten journals showed the vocabulary of someone deeply read in forensic psychology and human anatomy. Between 2016 and 2019, 9 victims were found across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. All of them women, all of them posed, not in the theatrical sense. No makeup, no costumes, just rearranged, arms crossed over their chest, eyes glued open, and something far worse, signs of post-mortem dissection. Not full autopsies, just precise, intimate removals, a fingernail, a piece of scalp. One victim was missing her entire ear, another, her lower jawbone. Yet despite this horror, there was no signature left behind. No trace DNA, no fibers, no prints, no sexual assault. It was as if the killer wanted the body not for pleasure or even power, but for study. The FBI labeled it high-risk behavior, calling Breyer a post-contact sadist. But even that term felt clinical. What they were dealing with wasn't just sadism, it was invasive obsession. Every victim had one thing in common, not profession, not appearance, but interaction. All of them had reported being followed or harassed by a man weeks before their deaths, and all of them had filed those reports anonymously online, forums, local tip sites, or social media posts. Micah Breyer wasn't choosing strangers. He was stalking women who had already sensed his presence, women who had tried to name the fear. And somehow, he knew. What unraveled the case wasn't a break-in or an error. It was a storm. In April 2019, a flood in eastern Washington collapsed part of a hiking trail, revealing a sealed crawl space beneath an old maintenance shed. Inside were 5 vacuum-sealed bags, each containing small biological samples. Labeled, preserved, cataloged, not trophies, specimens, and among the tools and plastic and refrigerants was a lined notebook. The first page read, in cursive, "A body is a memory you can touch." What followed were 200 pages of diagrams, notes, and entries written in the second person, as if he were speaking not to himself, but to someone, or something. The entries weren't confessions. They were rituals, instructions, descriptions of breath patterns, eye movement, blood clotting, and the final entry, "I never meant to break them, I only wanted to see how the light left." That sentence alone gave the task force pause, because this wasn't a killer who viewed death as an endpoint. It was a doorway, and every time he opened it, he stepped a little further through. Investigators cross-referenced handwriting samples with area shelter sign-in logs, GED applications, and even handwriting from local library suggestion cards. They got a match in Yakima, Washington, a man who had checked out multiple books on embalming and cranial surgery. But by the time they found the trailer, it was empty, bleached, scrubbed. The only thing left was a mattress, sliced down the middle, its foam gutted like a body. The hunt intensified. But Micah Breyer never resurfaced. Some believe he died, others believe he reinvented himself, perhaps even working in a legitimate medical field now. But the chilling part isn't where he went, it's what he taught. Since the case broke, over 24 copycats have emerged across the US, most of them young, male, and isolated, each echoing some part of his methods: dissection, display, silence, and always the same type of victim. Women who once said, "I think someone is watching me." To this day, Breyer's case is used in FBI seminars on behavioral deviance and forensic staging, but no profile fully fits him, because he didn't need chaos like Denton. He didn't want justice like Wade. He wanted access, and once he got in, he didn't want to leave. The body, to Breyer, wasn't sacred or symbolic. It was a puzzle that couldn't scream anymore. And that's what made him the most disturbing of all. Because even now, even after all the warnings and press and podcasts and documentaries, women still go to police stations and say the same line, "I think someone's watching me." And sometimes when they go missing, the reports still say, No signs of struggle, no DNA, no prints, just the quiet, rearranged body, staring back. There's a different kind of silence that follows a killer like Micah Breyer. It isn't the silence of closure or justice. It's the silence of doubt. After Breyer disappeared, the public conversation didn't stop. It just shifted. Women whispered more quietly. Men stared longer before looking away. And investigators, the ones who had spent years hunting ghosts, began questioning how many faces they passed every day that might be carrying the same stillness, the same hunger. But even in that paranoia, there was an expectation, a pattern, a belief that the next killer would be like the last. A stalker, a shadow, someone who vanished between the cracks. That's why the shock was so violent when Killer 5 didn't whisper. He screamed, not in words, not even in sound, but in presentation. His name was never printed in headlines, not the real one. But online, the name he gave himself was Pastor's Son, and for 2 long years he made sure every town he entered remembered what he brought. Unlike the others, Pastor's Son didn't target in silence. He made introductions. Each time he arrived in a new small town, Arkansas, Kansas, West Virginia, Ohio, there were signs. Graffiti on the edge of abandoned churches, flyers posted to lampposts, Bible pages stuffed in school lockers, always with the same words handwritten over scripture. There is rot in the pews. But no one connected it at first, not until the first body was found. In Beckley, West Virginia, a substitute teacher named Marie Holden was discovered tied to the altar of a derelict chapel on the outskirts of town. Her mouth was sewn shut with waxed thread. Her body was not mutilated, but her skin had been bleached white, dressed in a church robe, and her eyes replaced with glass communion marbles. No blood, no defensive wounds, just a single note tucked beneath her folded hands. They called it forgiveness. I called it forgetting. The town reeled, but there was no suspect, just local legends, theories, whispers that the killer must be punishing hypocrisy, a vigilante against abuse. But that illusion didn't last, because a month later, it happened again, and again. 8 women, different towns, all with ties to church groups, Christian schools, or youth ministries. But none were confirmed predators. Some were victims of abuse themselves. Others had simply worked under someone accused. The FBI's behavioral unit described the pattern as moral vengeance corrupted by delusion. Pastor's Son didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a mirror, forcing communities to stare at what they had buried in sanctified silence. And the more he was ignored, the louder his symbolism became. In Iowa, he replaced a woman's blood with holy water from a stolen font. In Oklahoma, he shaved scripture into a victim's scalp using a straight razor from a seminary dorm. His crimes weren't just executions, they were ritualized accusations, and he made sure the public saw them. But the most horrifying part wasn't the spectacle, it was the timing. Every death occurred exactly 40 days after Pastor's Son arrived in a town. That was his window, and each time he left warning signs. The graffiti, the flyers, the scripture distortions. It was like he wanted people to stop him, like part of him was daring someone to intervene. But no one ever did, not in time, because his real weapon wasn't violence, it was shame. Every town that found a body had also ignored a warning. Every victim was surrounded by missed chances. He turned morality into a weapon, and silence into guilt. And in every case, local churches were forced to confront not just a crime scene, but a legacy, a history. Authorities finally caught a glimpse of him after victim 6. A surveillance camera near a burned-down chapel in Missouri caught a man in clerical black clothing standing at the edge of a field. He wasn't fleeing. He was standing still, watching the building smolder. No mask, no panic, just presence. The footage was blurred by smoke, but facial recognition linked it to a man named Adam Rhett, who whose father had been a preacher in rural Tennessee. Rhett had vanished in 2011 after his father was accused of serial abuse and excommunicated. Police found Rhett's childhood home abandoned, the walls carved with fragmented scripture and burned photos. His bedroom closet had been converted into a prayer cell, walls lined with insulation, a single wooden stool, and hundreds of sticky notes bearing handwritten sins. Not his own, other people's. Names, dates, confessions, some publicly known, others deeply private. Many belonged to people who would later become his victims. But despite the breakthrough, Rhett, if it was him, was always one step ahead. He traveled by bus, changed names often, and used burner phones rarely, and only to call local religious radio stations under fake testimonials. The FBI labeled him a narrative killer, someone who doesn't just murder but forces his story onto the world. He didn't want to hide. He wanted to preach, to punish. And in his mind, he was saving something. Not souls, but truth. Pastor's son hasn't struck since 2021, but religious communities across the Midwest still report occasional sightings. Strange messages left in hymnals, burned offering plates, a pair of glass marbles left in a baptismal font, and always the same whisper, online or in person. He only comes when they pretend not to see. Unlike the previous killers, Pastor's son didn't vanish into shadows. He etched himself into the walls, into the sermons, into the memories of every town that tried to wash his blood away with prayer. And that's why, in a way, he succeeded. Because now, when a congregation hears a knock at the chapel door, they don't just fear sin, they fear the one who might come to collect it. The shadow of Pastor's son didn't fade quietly. It lingered like a stain no amount of prayer or charity could cleanse. In the wake of his terror, towns once vibrant with hymns and community gatherings were left hollow, their faith tested, their trust shattered. Survivors of his reign told stories not just of horror, but of relentless dread, as if the killer's gaze had become a permanent fixture in their lives, a silent accusation whispered behind every sermon and in every prayer. Families fractured under suspicion, neighbors eyed one another warily, wondering if the rot he spoke of had crept deeper than they dared admit. Authorities scrambled to keep pace with a killer who vanished like a ghost, yet left behind an unmistakable mark on the very soul of the communities he touched. Church leaders were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. How many abuses had gone unreported? How many sins had been hidden beneath the polished veneer of sanctity? The more they looked, the more they found. But for every secret uncovered, there was a whispered threat that justice was still coming. Some said Pastor's son became less a man and more a movement, a reckoning incarnate summoned by silence and complacency. And that legacy was terrifyingly alive. In the years following the last confirmed killing, local law enforcement agencies noticed a rise in anonymous threats and vandalism targeting religious institutions. Defaced crosses, shattered stained glass, sermons interrupted by cryptic messages scrawled in pews. Many dismissed these as the work of vandals or pranksters, but those who knew the case better understood it as echoes of Pastor's son's presence. Perhaps the greatest fear wasn't his return, but the idea that his ideology had spread, infecting the minds of those who felt abandoned or betrayed by the very faith he claimed to defend. And while no new bodies were found, the fear never truly dissipated. Churches installed security cameras, congregations held emergency meetings, community watch groups formed to guard against an unseen threat. The FBI continued to monitor every hint of his name online, every coded message in chat rooms where conspiracy and cultism blurred into obsession. And in the silence that followed, a new horror emerged. The fear that the true pastor's son might never be caught because he no longer needed to kill. He had already won by turning a generation against itself, by weaponizing shame and fear until every shadow could be a threat. Somewhere in the winding back roads and small towns of America, his story has become legend, whispered in warnings to teenagers walking home alone or parents dropping kids off at youth group. The faceless man with the glass marbles for eyes, the one who punishes not with fire or steel, but with the relentless judgment of silence. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all. Pastor's son never wanted to be a ghost. He wanted to be a mirror, a reflection of everything people refused to see, and in doing so, he became a legend, a specter lurking just beyond the stained glass, watching, waiting. Because in his world, sins aren't forgiven or forgotten. They're collected, counted, and eventually repaid. What connects a man who meticulously carved human flesh as if crafting a meal, a deranged stalker who silenced his victims in noise, a vengeful executor who delivered death with the cold efficiency of a ledger, an invasive sadist who dissected bodies like puzzles, and a self-styled moral arbiter who turned churches into stages of judgment? On the surface, their motives, methods, and madness seem wildly different, fractured reflections of distinct psychoses. Yet beneath the surface lies a deeper thread, a chilling symmetry not of their violence, but of what their existence exposes. Each one, in his own way, embodies a fracture in the American psyche, a splintered relationship between identity, power, and the silence that follows evil. Grant Toller, with his surgical dissection of morality and flesh, dared to dismantle the very boundaries of humanity and consumption. His crimes whispered questions about the ethics of survival and the unspoken rituals embedded in daily life. Rudy Denton's violent silencing forced a reckoning with the cacophony of modern existence, reminding us how fragile communication truly is and how easily it can be weaponized. Ellis Wade, the cold accountant of vengeance, personified the bitter calculus of justice denied, turning retribution into a ledger that balanced lives like numbers. Micah Breyer's obsessive dissections delved into the invasion of privacy and the erasure of self, a grotesque metaphor for the way technology and surveillance dissolve boundaries we once held sacred. And Pastor's son stood as a dark preacher of reckoning, wielding shame and spectacle as tools to force society to face its hidden sins. Together, they are not just killers. They are the distorted mirrors of our fears, the dark embodiments of the fractures within justice, community, and the self. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths, that evil often wears the guise of normalcy, that silence can be complicit, and that the boundaries of humanity are not fixed, but fragile, easily broken by indifference or malice. In every neighborhood where one of these men struck, communities grappled with more than loss. They struggled with suspicion, betrayal, and the unsettling realization that someone among them could harbor such darkness without warning. The patterns they left behind are as instructive as they are terrifying. They reveal a chilling progression, the erosion of privacy, the abuse of trust, the weaponization of faith, and the cold logic of vengeance. They remind us that while society builds walls and systems to protect, it also leaves gaps wide enough for monsters to slip through. And perhaps most hauntingly, they expose the spaces where silence and inaction become as deadly as violence itself. These killers were not anomalies, they were warnings. The echo of what happens when empathy falters, when justice is delayed, when society chooses to look away. Their legacies ripple beyond their crimes, influencing how law enforcement approaches profiling, how communities rebuild after trauma, and how individuals learn to trust or fear those around them. They have reshaped policies on victim support, privacy laws, and mental health interventions. Yet, for all the progress, the shadows they cast remain. Because the truth is, the worst monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys or behind prison bars. Sometimes they walk quietly beside us, dressed as neighbors, teachers, pastors, or strangers in the crowd. Their evil is not always loud or visible. Often it is measured, deliberate, and terrifyingly close to the fabric of everyday life. And that realization is the coldest comfort of all. that evil is not an exception to humanity, but a dark thread woven into its tapestry. As the sun sets over towns once shattered by these 5 killers, the silence that falls is not peace. It is a reminder, a call to vigilance, to remembering the names, the faces, and the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Because in remembering, we reclaim the light from the darkness they sought to claim. The stories of Grant Toller, Rudy Denton, Ellis Wade, Micah Breyer, and Pastor's son do not end with conviction, disappearance, or death. They end with questions, unspoken, unresolved, and echoing in the spaces between justice and oblivion. What does it mean when a man like Toller can dissect human life as if it were no more than a recipe? When Denton's rage silences not just voices, but the very essence of communication. When Wade's ledger calls out to systems built on law but blind to corruption. When Breyer invades the sanctity of the body without leaving a trace. When Pastor's son turns sanctuaries into altars of fear and retribution. These questions linger because their existence forces a confrontation with the darkest parts of ourselves and the society we inhabit. Their crimes reveal not just individual pathology, but systemic fracture, the spaces where neglect, silence, and apathy create fertile ground for evil to grow. Each killer exploited a unique vulnerability, be it the complacency of communities, the fractures in justice, the invisibility of victims, or the weaponization of faith. Yet together they form a tapestry of warning. They remind us that evil is multifaceted, adapting, and often intertwined with the very structures meant to protect us. Their shadows fall not only on victims and families, but also on every bystander, every law enforcement official, every citizen who must ask how they failed to see or stop the darkness before it struck. In the quiet moments, beyond headlines and courtrooms, the real horror lies in realizing that the monsters were never truly other. They were reflections of a society grappling with its own fractures. Places where empathy faltered, where justice delayed or denied, where silence spoke louder than screams. And while their names are etched into the annals of crime, their stories serve as a somber reminder that evil does not wear a single face, nor does it come with a warning. It is woven into the fabric of humanity, waiting for cracks to appear. The legacies of these 5 killers are not just tales of death. They are calls to vigilance, empathy, and action. They compel us to look deeper, to listen closer, and to refuse the comfort of denial. Because the true test of a society is not how it punishes monsters, but how it prevents them, by addressing the fractures that gave rise to them, by standing with the vulnerable, and by never turning away from the shadows, no matter how quiet they become. In the end, the darkness they left behind is not an end, but a beginning, an enduring challenge to face the complexity of evil with honesty, courage, and an unwavering commitment to remember those who vanished, those who fought, and those who still walk among us, unseen but not forgotten. The aftermath of these killers' reigns did not simply vanish into court verdicts or prison walls. Instead, it seeped into the collective consciousness of the communities left behind and the broader society watching from afar. Families struggled not only with grief, but with the gnawing question of how someone so monstrous could live unnoticed among them. How did the systems designed to protect fail? How did the everyday people around these men not see the cracks? Social workers and psychologists reported increased cases of trauma, survivor's guilt, and pervasive fear that the cycle could start again. News outlets churned out analysis and opinion pieces debating whether society breeds such killers or simply fails to stop them in time. Law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews, leading to reforms in missing person investigations, cross-jurisdictional communication, and early intervention protocols. Mental health advocacy groups leveraged the stories to push for expanded services, emphasizing the silent signs of potential violence. Schools and religious organizations reevaluated safety and reporting measures. Yet, Despite these efforts, the sense of unease persisted. The notion that evil adapts, learning from past failures, morphing to evade new defenses. For every policy change, there was a chilling reminder, another name whispered in the dark, another shadow slipping through the cracks, and beyond policy and public outrage, the legacy of these killers shaped how America understood the nature of evil itself. It shattered the myth that all killers fit a mold or that they operate only in dark, distant places. Instead, it revealed a spectrum of darkness, from the clinical precision of Toller to the primal chaos of Denton, from Wade's cold calculations to Breyer's invasive obsession, and finally, the moralistic terror of Pastor's son. Each showed that evil is not just an act, but a process, a progression fed by silence, neglect, and sometimes twisted conviction. Their stories became case studies not just in crime, but in human fragility and the societal structures that fail to protect the most vulnerable. It became clear that prevention is not just about catching killers, but about nurturing communities where empathy outweighs indifference and vigilance is a collective responsibility. The national dialogue shifted slowly but surely. Conversations about mental health, systemic injustice, and the role of faith in healing and harm took center stage. But even as the world sought answers, the question lingered. How many more stories like these go untold? How many more killers hide behind facades of normalcy, waiting for their moment? The answer is unknowable. And that unknowability fuels a persistent fear, the fear that beneath the surface of everyday life, the seeds of darkness quietly take root. For in that shadowed soil, monsters grow. And it is only through vigilance, awareness, and unyielding courage that they might be stopped before the next name is added to the list. In the final reckoning, these 5 men stand as grim pillars in the dark architecture of American crime. Their lives, their acts, their legacies weave a complex tapestry of horror and human failure. A story not just about death, but about the space between lives, the fractures in society, and the shadows lurking within the human soul. Each killer, with his unique methodology and motivation, underscores a painful truth: that evil does not discriminate by background, belief, or circumstance. It is adaptable, insidious, and often born in places we least expect. Within the quiet house next door, the trusted pulpit, the overlooked worker, the isolated loner. And while the justice system may mark their end, the questions they raise endure. How can communities rebuild trust after such profound breaches? How can systems learn to detect the quiet signs before devastation unfolds? How can individuals balance the need for safety with the imperative of compassion, knowing that suspicion can also destroy? The impact of these killers ripples beyond victims and families. It challenges the very fabric of societal cohesion. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable realities about prejudice, mental health, poverty, and the failings of institutions designed to safeguard the vulnerable. Yet amid the darkness, these stories also illuminate paths forward through reform, education, and collective action. They remind us that the power to prevent future tragedies lies not just in law enforcement or policy, but in the everyday choices made by neighbors, teachers, clergy, and citizens. The haunting legacy of Grant Toller, Rudy Denton, Ellis Wade, Micah Breyer, and Pastor's son is a call to vigilance, to listen when voices falter, to see what others ignore, to act before silence becomes tragedy. Their stories are a solemn testament to the fragility of life and the enduring resilience required to protect it. And as the final chapter closes, it leaves us with a chilling truth. Evil never truly disappears. It only waits, waiting for cracks to widen, for doors to open, for the light to dim. But so too does hope. The hope that through awareness, empathy, and unyielding resolve, the next story will be different, that the silence will break not with screams, but with the courage to face the darkness before it claims another soul. In the stillness after the storm, that hope is the last light we hold. In the quiet moments after the headlines fade and the courts fall silent, the shadows linger. These killers were never just monsters of flesh and blood. They were reflections of the fractures within us all. Their stories remind us that evil is not always loud, nor always visible. It grows in silence, in neglect, in the spaces where we fail to see and fail to act. Remember their names, not to feed fear, but to fuel vigilance. Because the darkest threats are those we never suspect, and the most dangerous silence is the one we choose to ignore.